Hello, dear friends. Today I want to share with you a story about Grace Thompson. Have you ever felt like your entire world was crumbling beneath your feet? That's exactly where Grace found herself on that cold February morning in Riverside, California, when everything she thought she knew about life was about to change forever. The alarm on Grace Thompson's phone buzzed at 4:30 in the morning, cutting through the silence of her 15-year-old Toyota Camry like a knife through silk. She stirred in the reclined driver's seat, her neck stiff from another night of sleeping at an angle that would make any chiropractor weep. At 32, Grace had learned to measure time not in hours or days, but in small survivals. Another night safely spent, another morning where she and 7-year-old Emma were still together, still breathing, still fighting. Through the fogged windows, she could see the orange glow of the 24-hour diner across the parking lot, the same diner where she'd be serving coffee and eggs in exactly 90 minutes. She rubbed her eyes and glanced into the back seat where Emma slept, curled under a donated blanket that smelled faintly of lavender fabric softener, a luxury from their old life that now felt like a memory from someone else's story. The child's face was peaceful, innocent, unaware that home had become a vehicle parked behind a strip mall. Emma's dark hair spilled across the pillow Grace had fashioned from rolled-up sweaters, and for a moment, watching her daughter's steady breathing, Grace felt something that wasn't quite hope but wasn't despair either. It was the space between giving up and holding on, the place where mothers learn to live when the world has stripped away everything except love. Grace's chest tightened the way it did every morning when reality settled in before courage could take hold. She was 32 years old, a college dropout turned waitress, motel housekeeper, and weekend grocery store clerk. Three jobs weren't enough to cover first and last month's rent anywhere decent, not with childcare costs and the medical bills still piling up from Emma's asthma treatments. The eviction 6 months ago had felt like the final nail in a coffin she'd been building since Robert walked out when Emma was 5. Robert. Even thinking his name made her stomach clench with a mixture of rage and relief. 3 years of marriage that had felt like 30 years of walking on eggshells, never knowing which version of him would come home. The charming Robert who could make Emma laugh until she hiccuped, or the other Robert, the one whose hands left bruises that Grace learned to hide with long sleeves and careful makeup. When he finally left, taking their savings and her sense of safety with him, Grace had told herself she was strong enough to handle it alone. Most days she believed it. Other days, like this one, she felt like drowning in slow motion, each breath a conscious choice rather than a reflex. She slipped out of the car quietly, careful not to wake Emma, and walked across the empty parking lot toward the diner's employee entrance. The desert air was cold, biting against her skin, a sharp contrast to the brutal heat that would arrive by noon. She pushed through the back door and into the familiar smell of grease, coffee, and industrial cleaner. The scent of survival, of making it through another day. "You're early," Dale, her manager, said without looking up from the prep station. It wasn't a compliment, just an observation. Dale was the kind of man who wore authority like a shirt that was too tight, always aware of the discomfort but never willing to change sizes. "Couldn't sleep," Grace lied, tying her apron around her waist. The truth was simpler and more complicated. She'd learned that staying busy was the only way to keep the thoughts at bay. The ones that whispered about how she'd failed, how Emma deserved better, how some people just weren't meant to catch a break. The morning shift passed in a blur of burnt toast, impatient truckers, and coffee refills. By 9 o'clock, Grace's feet ached, her back throbbed, and she still had 4 more hours before she could clock out and drive Emma to the library, where the air conditioning was free and the bathrooms were clean. The library had become their sanctuary, a place where Emma could be a child instead of a tiny adult, worried about where they'd sleep next. It was during her 10-minute break, sitting on a milk crate behind the dumpster, that her phone buzzed. Not the usual buzz of a spam call or overdue bill reminder, but an actual call from a number she didn't recognize. She almost ignored it. Almost. In her experience, unknown numbers brought bad news, collections calls, or false promises. But something made her answer. "Hello, is this Grace Elena Thompson?" The voice was formal, clipped, professional. The kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd never slept in their car. "Who's asking?" Grace's guard went up automatically. She'd learned to be suspicious of anyone who used her full name. "My name is Harrison Wells. I'm an attorney with Wells and Associates in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I've been trying to reach you regarding the estate of your late uncle, Thomas Marcus Thompson." Grace blinked, her coffee growing cold in her hands. "I think you have the wrong person. I don't have an uncle in New Mexico." "You did," the lawyer said gently, his tone softening just enough to suggest he'd delivered this kind of news before. "He passed away 3 months ago. According to our records, you're his only living relative. Your father's younger brother. They were estranged for most of their adult lives, which may be why you weren't aware of him." Grace's father had died when she was 12, a heart attack that struck him down in the middle of mowing their tiny front lawn. She remembered fragments, his laugh that started deep in his chest, his calloused hands that were surprisingly gentle when braiding her hair, the way he used to call her his brave little warrior. But an uncle, a brother, he'd never mentioned it, not once. "I don't understand," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you calling me?" "Because he left you everything, his estate, his property, and all contents therein. It's unconventional, to say the least, but it's legally binding. The property is yours if you want it." Grace's pulse quickened, that familiar flutter of hope mixed with suspicion. In her experience, good news was usually bad news wearing a disguise. "What kind of property?" There was a pause, like the lawyer was choosing his words carefully. "It's a private residence built into a natural cave system in the New Mexico high desert, quite remote. Your uncle was a private man, some might say reclusive, but the property is fully paid for, and there are no outstanding debts. I'd recommend you come see it before making any decisions. I can email you the details." "A cave house?" Grace repeated, her voice hollow. "You're telling me I inherited a cave house from an uncle I've never heard of?" "That's correct. There's one more thing, Miss Thompson. Your uncle left a letter for you. I'm instructed to give it to you in person when you arrive. He was very specific about that." After the call ended, Grace sat on that milk crate for another 5 minutes, staring at the cracked asphalt, her mind spinning. A cave house, an uncle she'd never known, a letter waiting for her in the desert. It sounded like the beginning of a fairy tale, or the setup for a cruel joke. But as she looked down at her stained apron, her chapped hands, and thought about Emma sleeping in the backseat of a car, she realized she had nothing to lose except more of the same. That night, after her shift at the motel where she scrubbed toilets and changed sheets stained with other people's stories, Grace sat in the car with her laptop balanced on her knees, powered by the diner's Wi-Fi that reached just far enough into the parking lot. Emma was inside the diner, finishing homework at a corner booth under the watchful eye of Carla, a waitress who had a soft spot for the kid. Grace opened the email from Harrison Wells. Attached were photos, documents, and a map with directions. The property was located 70 miles outside of Santa Fe, deep in the high desert near the Gemmas Mountains. The photos showed a structure that looked like it had been carved directly into a massive sandstone cliff face, as if the mountain itself had opened up to create a home. The entrance was a heavy wooden door set into the rock, almost hidden by natural formations and desert vegetation. There were small windows cut into the stone, but they were sparse, intentional, designed to blend with the landscape rather than announce human presence. It looked ancient and modern at the same time, like something out of a fantasy novel or a National Geographic documentary about cliff dwellings. One photo showed the interior, and Grace's breath caught in her throat. Smooth stone walls caught natural light filtering through skylights carved into the rock above. The furniture looked expensive and minimal. Leather couches, handcrafted wooden tables, shelves that appeared to be carved directly into the living rock. It was beautiful in a strange, isolated way that spoke of someone who had chosen solitude not as punishment, but as protection. Grace zoomed in on every detail, her designer's eye, dormant since art school, awakening for the first time in years. There was a kitchen with modern appliances and stone countertops, a bathroom with what looked like a natural spring shower, and what appeared to be multiple bedrooms, all of it built into the earth itself, protected by layers of stone that had stood for millions of years. She read through the deed, the title, the property tax records. It was all legitimate. Her name was listed as the sole heir. The property had been in Thomas Thompson's name since 1997, paid off in full. No mortgage, no liens, no strings except for the mystery of why a man she'd never met had chosen her as his beneficiary. "Who are you, Uncle Thomas?" Grace whispered to the screen. She looked up at Emma through the diner window. Her daughter was coloring, her tongue poking out in concentration, oblivious to the fact that their entire world might be about to change. Grace made a decision that felt less like choosing and more like surrendering to possibility. They would go. She'd take 3 days off from work, load Emma into the car, and drive the 8 hours to New Mexico. If it was real, if it was livable, maybe they'd finally have a roof over their heads that didn't require an ignition key. If it wasn't, well, they'd still have the car, and at least Emma would have had an adventure. Can you imagine making that choice? When you're at the end of your rope, sometimes the only direction left is forward, even when you can't see where the path leads. The next morning, Grace told her managers she needed time off for a family emergency. Dale grumbled but approved it. Good waitresses who showed up on time were hard to find, even in Riverside. She packed what little they had, clothes that could fit in 2 garbage bags, toiletries, Emma's asthma inhaler, and stuffed rabbit, and a folder containing every important document she owned. Their entire lives compressed into what could fit in the trunk of a 15-year-old Toyota. The drive through Arizona and into New Mexico felt like traveling to another planet. The landscape shifted from sprawling suburban desert to high plains, from flat emptiness to rolling hills dotted with juniper and pinyon trees. Emma pressed her face to the window, pointing at hawks circling overhead and asking 1,000 questions Grace didn't have answers to. "Are we really going to live in a cave, Mama?" "Maybe, baby. We'll see." "Like Batman?" Grace smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt in weeks. "Something like that." They stopped for gas in a town called Española, where Grace asked for directions. The clerk, an older woman with silver braids and turquoise jewelry, raised her eyebrows when Grace mentioned the property location. "You're going out to the Thompson place?" She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Everyone knows it, or knows of it. That man who lived there, Thomas, he kept to himself. Came into town maybe twice a year for supplies, paid in cash, didn't talk much. Folks said he was some kind of government man once, maybe a scientist, maybe something else. Hard to tell with those types." "What types?" Grace asked, her stomach tightening with the familiar sensation of things being more complicated than they appeared. "The kind who have reasons for disappearing," the woman said simply. "High deserts full of people running from something or towards something, usually both." She straightened up, her manner becoming more businesslike. "But he never caused trouble, so people left him alone. You family?" "Something like that," Grace said, not wanting to explain the complicated truth of inheriting from a stranger. The last 20 miles were on a dirt road that wound through canyons and mesas, the kind of road that didn't show up on most GPS systems. Grace's Camry rattled and groaned over the ruts, kicking up dust that hung in the air like smoke signals announcing their arrival to a landscape that had probably seen more secrets than visitors. Emma had fallen asleep in the back seat, and Grace was starting to wonder if she'd made a terrible mistake when she saw it. The cliff face rose ahead of them like a wall of red and orange sandstone, striped with layers of ancient sediment that told the story of oceans and deserts, of time measured in geological epochs rather than human struggles. And there, tucked into a natural alcove about 30 feet above the desert floor, was the entrance. A set of stone steps had been carved into the rock with the kind of precision that spoke of both artistry and engineering. The entire structure seemed to grow out of the earth itself, camouflaged and commanding at the same time. Grace parked the car and sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the wheel, adrenaline surging through her system. The silence was absolute. No traffic, no sirens, no voices, just wind and the distant cry of a hawk riding the thermals above the canyon. "We're here," she whispered, more to herself than to the sleeping child. Emma stirred. "Is this it, Mama?" "Yeah, baby, this is it." They climbed out of the car, and Grace felt the full weight of the silence. It wasn't empty silence. It was full silence, pregnant with possibility and secrets, and the kind of peace she'd forgotten existed. She took Emma's hand, and they walked toward the stone steps. Each step had been worn smooth by time and use, and Grace wondered how many times Thomas had climbed them, what he'd been thinking during those solitary ascents and descents. At the top, the door was exactly as it had appeared in the photos. Thick, weathered wood reinforced with iron bands that spoke of both medieval craftsmanship and modern security concerns. There was no doorbell, no knocker, just a heavy iron handle and a keyhole that looked like it belonged in a castle. Harrison Wells had mailed her the key along with the documents. She pulled it from her pocket now, a large, old-fashioned key that seemed to carry the weight of secrets. Her hand trembled slightly as she slid it into the lock. It turned smoothly, and the door opened with a low groan that echoed into the space beyond. Grace stepped inside, and her breath caught in her throat. The interior was nothing like she'd expected, even after seeing the photos. The main room was enormous, a natural cavern that had been carefully shaped and finished with an attention to detail that bordered on obsession. The walls were smooth stone, polished to a soft sheen that seemed to glow in the natural light, filtering through skylights cut through the rock at strategic angles. The ceiling soared 20 feet above them, creating a sense of space that felt both intimate and infinite. The floor was a seamless blend of smooth stone and inlaid wood, beautiful and functional in a way that spoke of someone who understood both form and function. Furniture was minimal but expensive. A leather couch that looked like it had cost more than Grace made in a year. A handmade wooden table that could have been museum-worthy, shelves carved directly into the rock walls. To the left was a kitchen area that belonged in a magazine, stainless steel appliances, stone countertops, a sink fed by what must have been an underground spring. The water that trickled from the tap was crystal clear and tasted like nothing Grace had ever experienced, clean and cold and somehow alive. To the right, a hallway carved into the rock led deeper into the cliff. Everything was clean, dust-free, like someone had just been there. The air smelled faintly of sage and stone and something else, something that reminded Grace of her father's workshop, a smell of careful hands and patient work. "Mama," Emma breathed, her voice full of wonder. "It's like a palace." Grace walked slowly through the space, running her hands along the walls, trying to process what she was seeing. There was electricity. She could see outlets and light switches discreetly placed along the stone walls. There was plumbing. This wasn't some primitive cave dwelling. This was a home, a real home, built with skill and resources that suggested Thomas Thompson had been far more than a simple recluse. She found the bedrooms down the hallway. 3 of them, each carved into the rock with the same attention to detail. One had clearly been Thomas's, a simple bed with military corners, a wooden dresser, a desk still scattered with papers. Another was empty except for a meditation cushion and a single window that framed the desert like a living painting. The third was smaller, perfect for a child, with built-in shelves and a skylight that turned the ceiling into a window to the stars. "Can this be my room?" Emma asked, her eyes wide with the kind of hope Grace had been afraid to feel. "Yeah, baby," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't name. "Yeah, it can." They spent the next hour exploring. Grace found a bathroom with a shower carved into the living rock and a soaking tub that looked like a natural pool. She found a pantry stocked with canned goods and dried foods, enough to last months. She found a storage room filled with tools, outdoor gear, and boxes labeled with dates going back decades. And she found something else, something that made her pause and run her fingers along the stone with new understanding. In the main room, near the back wall, there was a section of stone that didn't match the rest. It was smoother, newer, like it had been sealed recently. Grace pressed her hand against it and felt a faint coolness, like there was empty space behind it. She knocked gently. The sound was hollow, echoing. "What's back there, Mama?" Emma asked, appearing at her side with the curiosity of a child who had never learned that some doors were better left unopened. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I think Uncle Thomas wanted us to find out." That night, they slept in real beds for the first time in 6 months. Emma curled up under clean sheets in her new room, clutching her stuffed rabbit and whispering that she felt like a princess in a magic castle. Grace lay in the larger bedroom, staring up at the stone ceiling that had sheltered her uncle for decades, her mind racing with questions and possibilities. Tomorrow she would drive back to town and meet with Harrison Wells. Tomorrow she would read the letter Thomas had left. Tomorrow she would start asking the questions that were already forming in her mind. But tonight she let herself rest, let herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe the universe hadn't forgotten about her after all. Maybe buried in the desert, hidden in the stone, there was something waiting for her, something that would change everything. Have you ever felt that moment when hope returns after a long absence? When you realize that maybe, just maybe, your story isn't over. It's just been waiting for the right chapter to begin? The morning light filtered through the skylights in shafts of gold, warming the stone walls and filling the cave house with a soft, almost ethereal glow. Grace woke slowly, her body confused by the comfort of an actual mattress, her mind taking a moment to remember where she was. She sat up and looked around the room, half expecting to find herself back in the Camry. But no, the smooth stone walls were real. The hand-woven rug beneath her feet was real. This place, impossible as it still seemed, was real. She found Emma already awake, standing in the main room with her face pressed against one of the small windows, watching the desert come alive with morning light. A jackrabbit hopped across the red sand below, its long ears twitching at sounds only it could hear. Beyond it, the landscape stretched endlessly, a sea of mesas and canyons painted in shades of rust and amber. "Mama, there's so much space out there," Emma said, her breath fogging the window. "It's like the whole world is just for us." Grace joined her daughter at the window, wrapping her arms around the little girl's shoulders. It was true. As far as the eye could see, there was nothing but desert, mountains in the distance, and sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. After months of parking lots and strip malls, the vastness felt overwhelming and liberating at the same time. They made breakfast from the pantry supplies Thomas had left behind, oatmeal and coffee for Grace, cereal for Emma. As they ate at the wooden table, Grace found herself really looking at the space for the first time. Every detail spoke of careful planning and significant resources. The stonework was professional, The electrical and plumbing systems were modern and sophisticated. This wasn't the project of a weekend hobbyist. This was the work of someone who had both the knowledge and the means to build something extraordinary. After breakfast, Grace told Emma to stay inside and explore while she walked the property. She needed to understand this place, to see what else Thomas had left behind. She stepped outside onto the stone platform at the house entrance and looked down at their car, small and out of place against the red sandstone landscape. A path wound around the side of the cliff, leading upward. Grace followed it, her city-saw feet already protesting against the uneven rock. The path was narrow but well-maintained, carved into the cliff face with the same precision she'd seen everywhere else. As she climbed, she noticed details that hadn't been visible from below. Solar panels mounted flush against the rock face, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. A water collection system built into a natural depression, a satellite dish disguised to look like another boulder. Thomas had built this place to be completely self-sufficient, off the grid, invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. At the top of the mesa, Grace could see for miles in every direction, nothing but desert, mountains, and endless sky. She turned back toward the cliff edge and looked down at the house entrance. From this angle, it was almost completely hidden, just another shadow in the rock face. You could drive past it 100 times and never know it was there. "What were you hiding from, Uncle Thomas?" she asked the wind. "And why did you choose me to hide it with?" Back inside the house, she found Emma drawing pictures at the table, her face scrunched in concentration, a habit that reminded Grace of better times, when life held simple pleasures. Grace pushed away the bittersweet memory and focused on the desk in the corner. Thomas's desk. It was made of dark wood, heavy and solid, with drawers on both sides. Papers were scattered across the surface. Technical drawings, measurements, calculations. Thomas had been an engineer, or at least someone with engineering knowledge. The precision in these drawings was extraordinary, showing not just the house itself, but the entire cave system, with notations in neat handwriting that suggested decades of careful study. Grace opened the top right drawer. Inside were pens, pencils, a ruler, and a small leather-bound journal. She picked up the journal and flipped it open, her chest constricting as she saw page after page of entries in Thomas's careful handwriting. December 5th, 2003. Water filtration system operational. Can sustain indefinitely. March 22nd, 2005. Solar array upgraded. Power storage at 100% capacity. September 9th, 2008. Security protocols tested. Motion sensors functional. Security protocols. Motion sensors. Grace's pulse quickened. She flipped further back in the journal, searching for something more personal, more revealing. She found it near the beginning. January 1st, 2000. New year, new life. They'll never find it here. She'll never know what it cost. Better this way. She deserves better than the truth. Grace stared at the words. Who was she? His wife? A daughter? And what truth? She closed the journal and opened the other drawers systematically. More papers, more diagrams, old receipts from trips to Santa Fe and Albuquerque. Always paid in cash. No credit cards, no bank statements, nothing that would leave a digital trail. In the bottom left drawer, she found something different. A wooden box about the size of a shoebox with a small brass latch. She lifted it onto the desk and opened it carefully. Inside were photographs, old ones, faded and yellowed at the edges. She picked up the first one, and her breath caught. It was her father. She recognized him instantly, even though he was younger here, maybe in his 20s. He was standing next to another man who looked almost identical. Same dark hair, same strong jaw, same smile that had made Grace feel safe as a child. Brothers, they had to be. There were more photos. Her father and Thomas's children standing in front of a small house she didn't recognize. The two of them as teenagers, working on an old car, both grinning at the camera with grease-stained hands and the kind of careless happiness that belonged to people who hadn't yet learned that life could be cruel. Then the photos changed. Her father disappeared from them, and Thomas was alone, standing in front of buildings that looked official, government buildings maybe. One photo showed him in what looked like a laboratory, wearing a white coat, surrounded by equipment Grace didn't recognize. Another showed him shaking hands with men in suits, all of them unsmiling, the kind of handshake that seals deals rather than celebrates friendships. At the bottom of the box was a newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle. The headline read, "Los Alamos scientist questioned in security breach." The article was from 1996 and mentioned several researchers being investigated for potential espionage, though no names were listed. Los Alamos, the National Laboratory in New Mexico, one of the most secure research facilities in the country. Grace's hands trembled as she read the article, pieces of a puzzle beginning to form a picture she didn't want to see. "Oh my God," she whispered. Her uncle had worked at Los Alamos, and something had happened. Something serious enough that he disappeared into the desert and built this fortress of solitude. If Thomas had been involved in something illegal, something dangerous, what did that mean for her? For Emma? She put the photos back in the box and closed it, her mind racing. She needed to get to Santa Fe and talk to Harrison Wells. She needed to read that letter Thomas had left. But part of her was afraid of what it might say, afraid that this miracle, this beautiful cave house that had seemed like salvation, might actually be a curse. "Mama, can we go explore outside?" Emma's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. Grace looked at her daughter, so innocent, so trusting, and made a decision. Whatever secrets Thomas had buried here, whatever truth he'd been hiding, she would face it. But she would also protect Emma, always and above everything else. "Yeah, baby, let's go look around." They spent the afternoon exploring the immediate area around the cave house. There wasn't much to see, just rock and sand and the occasional lizard basking in the sun, but Emma was fascinated by everything. She collected interesting stones and made up stories about ancient civilizations that might have lived in these canyons. Grace let her play, let her be a child for once, while her own mind continued to churn through possibilities and fears. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of fire and blood, they headed back inside. Grace made them dinner from the pantry supplies, spaghetti with canned sauce, and they ate while watching the light fade through the windows. After Emma went to bed, Grace returned to the desk in Thomas's journal. She read every entry, searching for clues, for explanations. Most of it was technical, almost mundane, but scattered throughout were hints of something deeper, something that made her stomach clench with anxiety. June 15th, 2004. "They're still looking. Good thing I chose well. This place is perfect. Invisible." October 3rd, 2006. "Saw headlights on the ridge tonight. Too far to be a threat, but I'm watching. Always watching." December 20th, 2010. "Sometimes I wonder if I should have told Marcus the truth before he died. Maybe he would have understood, or maybe it would have killed him faster." Marcus, her father's name. Grace's throat tightened. Thomas had thought about reaching out, about revealing himself, but he hadn't. He'd stayed hidden until death forced his hand. And now here she was, holding the pieces of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. She closed the journal and looked around the cave house. Really looked at it. The security Thomas had mentioned in his entries. Where was it? She stood and began walking the perimeter of the main room, running her hands along the walls, looking for anything unusual. Near the kitchen, she found it. A small panel set flush with the stone, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. She pressed it, and it popped open, revealing a screen and a keypad below it. Grace stared at it, her adrenaline surging. A security system. Of course there was a security system. She pressed the power button, and the screen flickered to life, showing multiple camera feeds, views of the desert in all directions, the path leading up to the house, even the interior rooms where she stood. Her uncle hadn't just built a home, he'd built a surveillance system that would make the government jealous. Jesus, Grace breathed, scrolling through the feeds. If Thomas had felt the need for this level of security, what exactly had he been protecting or hiding from? That night, Grace barely slept. She lay in bed listening to the absolute silence of the desert, interrupted only by the occasional howl of a coyote in the distance. Every shadow seemed suspicious, every sound a potential threat. She kept thinking about the sealed wall in the main room, the hollow space behind it that called to her curiosity like a siren song. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow she would figure out what was back there. Tomorrow she would drive to Santa Fe and demand answers from Harrison Wells. Tomorrow she would decide whether this inheritance was a blessing or a trap. But tonight, she was just a single mother lying in a stone room carved into the earth, holding on to hope with both hands and praying she hadn't made the biggest mistake of her life. Little did she know the biggest revelations were still to come. Sometimes the truth we're searching for is hiding right behind the wall, waiting for us to find the courage to break through and face what lies beyond. The morning after their first full night in the cave house, Grace woke to find Emma already dressed and eating cereal at the kitchen table, her legs swinging beneath the chair. The child's adaptability never ceased to amaze her. 2 days ago, they'd been sleeping in a car, and now Emma had embraced their strange new home, as if living in a cliff dwelling was the most natural thing in the world. "Can we stay here forever, Mama?" Emma asked between bites. Grace poured herself coffee from the pot she'd made, the rich smell filling the stone room. "I don't know yet, baby. We'll see." But even as she said it, she felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. The drive to Santa Fe to meet with Harrison Wells loomed ahead, but first she wanted to understand this place better. She wanted to know what Thomas had really left her, not just the house itself, but all its secrets. After breakfast, Grace set Emma up with coloring books in the main room, then began a more thorough exploration of the cave house, this time looking not just at what was visible, but at what might be hidden. She started with the walls, running her hands along the smooth stone, tapping gently, listening for hollow spaces. The main room yielded nothing unusual, just solid rock polished to perfection. She moved to the hallway that led to the bedrooms. The walls here were narrower, more confined, and she noticed something she'd missed before: slight variations in the stone texture. Places where the rock seemed to have been cut and then resealed. She pressed against one section, and it moved slightly, just a fraction of an inch, but enough to make her nerves sing with electricity. "What are you hiding, Uncle Thomas?" she whispered. From the storage room, Grace retrieved the tools Thomas had left behind: hammers, chisels, pry bars, everything needed to work with stone. She selected a thin chisel and returned to the hallway, working the edge into the seam she'd found. The seal cracked with a sound like breaking ice, and a small section of stone facing popped loose, revealing a hollow space behind it. Grace's hands trembled as she pulled away more of the covering, uncovering a narrow passage carved into the rock, leading upward at a steep angle. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it into the darkness. The passage climbed for about 15 feet before leveling off, disappearing into shadows her phone's light couldn't penetrate. She shouldn't go in there alone. She should wait, call someone, ask for help. But curiosity and desperation were a powerful combination, and Grace had spent too many years being cautious, being afraid. She called out to Emma, "Baby, I'm going to check something. Stay right there and don't move." "Okay, Mama." Grace squeezed into the passage, her shoulders brushing against stone on both sides. The air was cooler here, and she could feel a faint breeze, which meant it led somewhere. She climbed awkwardly, using her hands to steady herself against the walls. her phone's light dancing across ancient rock that had probably never felt human touch until Thomas carved his way through it. The passage was claustrophobic, oppressive, and she had to fight down a surge of panic. What if she got stuck? What if the passage collapsed? But then she reached the top, and the passage opened into a chamber, maybe 10 feet across, with a ceiling just tall enough for her to stand. Her phone's light swept across the space, and she gasped. The walls were lined with metal shelving, and on those shelves were dozens of plastic storage containers, all labeled with dates and codes she didn't understand. Grace opened the nearest container and found documents, thousands of pages, all bearing official government letterheads. Los Alamos National Laboratory, Department of Energy, classification stamps reading confidential, secret, top secret. Her uncle hadn't just worked at Los Alamos, he'd stolen from it. She pulled out a handful of papers and scanned them quickly, her chest tightening with each revelation. Technical reports, research data, security protocols. Some containers held computer hard drives, old ones from the late 1990s and early 2000s. Others contained photographs, surveillance images of people she didn't recognize, notes written in Thomas's tight handwriting, detailing meetings, exchanges, suspicious activities. This wasn't just stolen research. This was evidence. Evidence of something big, something dangerous enough that Thomas had felt the need to hide it away for decades. Grace took photos of everything with her phone, documenting what she'd found, then carefully made her way back down the passage. When she emerged into the hallway, she was covered in dust and breathing hard, her mind reeling with implications she didn't want to consider. Emma looked up from her coloring book, concern written across her young face. "You okay, Mama?" "Yeah, baby, just exploring." But she wasn't okay. Her hands were shaking, and her mind was spinning with questions she was afraid to answer. If Thomas had stolen classified information, if he'd been hiding from the government or foreign agents or whoever, then this house wasn't a gift. It was a target, and she and Emma were now standing at ground zero. She needed to think. She needed to calm down and approach this rationally. But first, she needed to know if there were more secrets hidden in these walls. Grace walked to the section of wall in the main room that had sounded hollow when she knocked on it. If Thomas had hidden classified documents in one chamber, what else might he have concealed? She studied the wall carefully, running her hands over every inch of the stone. Near the bottom, almost at floor level, she found it, a small indentation, barely visible, shaped like a handprint. She pressed her palm against it, and nothing happened. She pressed harder and heard a soft click. The entire section of wall, about 6 feet wide and 8 feet tall, shifted inward an inch. Grace's breath caught. She pushed, and the wall swung open on hidden hinges, revealing a chamber beyond. Cool air rushed out, carrying a smell that was almost metallic, sharp and clean. She grabbed her phone and shone the light inside, and what she saw made her knees go weak. The chamber was larger than the document room, maybe 20 feet deep and 15 feet wide, carved into the solid rock with the same precision as the rest of the house. But it was what filled the chamber that made Grace's world tilt sideways. Gold bars, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, stacked against the walls and arranged in neat rows on wooden pallets. Each bar was roughly the size of a brick and stamped with markings she didn't recognize. Official seals, serial numbers, and the unmistakable words, U.S. Treasury Reserve. Have you ever found something that was both a blessing and a curse? Grace was about to discover that some gifts come with a price she never imagined. What do you think you would do in her situation? Tell us in the comments. Grace stood frozen in the doorway, her brain refusing to process what she was seeing. This couldn't be real. This had to be fake, some kind of elaborate movie prop. But as she stepped closer, as her trembling fingers touched the nearest bar, She felt the weight of it, probably 30 pounds of solid gold. She picked up the bar with both hands and turned it over, reading the markings. 999.9 fine gold, followed by a serial number and an official Treasury Department seal. Her nerves felt like live wires beneath her skin. She set the bar down and started counting rows, multiplying in her head, estimating. Each bar was probably worth $60,000, maybe $70,000 at current gold prices. And there were, she counted again to be sure, approximately 4,000 bars. 4,000 bars, 4,000 times 60,000, $240 million, maybe more. Grace stumbled backward, her legs giving out, and sat down hard on the stone floor. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room spun around her, and she had to put her head between her knees to keep from passing out. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. People like her didn't inherit cave houses filled with hundreds of millions of dollars in gold. People like her worked 3 jobs and slept in their cars and prayed for a break that never came. Except it had come, and she had no idea what to do about it. "Mama," Emma's voice called from the main room. "Can I have a snack?" Grace forced herself to stand, forced her voice to sound normal. "Yeah, baby, give me a minute." She stepped out of the chamber and pushed the wall closed, hearing it click back into place with a sound that felt like a door slamming on her old life. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely control them. She walked to the kitchen on autopilot, grabbed a granola bar from the pantry, and handed it to Emma. The child took it happily and returned to her coloring, completely unaware that their lives had just changed forever. Grace walked outside onto the stone platform, needing air, needing space to think. The desert stretched out before her, vast and indifferent, and she felt suddenly, terrifyingly small. Where had Thomas gotten that gold? How long had it been here? And who else knew about it? The questions came fast and furious, each one more frightening than the last. If the gold was stolen, and those treasury markings suggested it was, then someone would come looking for it eventually. They would tear this place apart. They would kill anyone who stood in their way. She thought about the security system, the cameras, the hidden passages. Thomas had been preparing for something. He'd been expecting visitors, dangerous ones, and now Grace was standing in his shoes, the inheritor not just of his home, but of his secrets and his enemies. Inside the house, she pulled out her phone and stared at the keypad, her fingers hovering over the numbers. She should call the police. She should call the FBI. She should report this immediately and let the authorities handle it. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the memory of all those classified documents in the hidden chamber. Evidence that suggested Thomas had been trying to expose something, trying to protect something. Maybe it was Harrison Wells' words echoing in her mind. He was very specific that the letter should be given to you in person. What if the gold wasn't the crime? What if it was the evidence? Grace made a decision. She would drive to Santa Fe tomorrow and meet with Harrison Wells. She would read Thomas's letter, and then, only then, would she decide what to do about the gold, about the documents, about all of it. Tonight she would act normal. She would feed Emma dinner, read her a bedtime story, and pretend that everything was fine. Tomorrow would bring answers, or at least she hoped it would. That evening, after Emma had fallen asleep, Grace returned to the sealed chamber. She opened it slowly, almost reverently, and stood in the doorway, staring at the gold. In the dim light from her phone, the bars seemed to glow, casting shadows that danced across the stone walls like living things. She thought about what this money could do. Emma could go to any college she wanted. They could have a real home, security, a future that wasn't defined by struggle and fear. But she also thought about the price, because money like this, hidden money, secret money, always came with a price. Thomas had paid it with his freedom, spending decades in isolation, always watching over his shoulder. Was she willing to pay the same price? Was she willing to risk Emma's safety for wealth that might be cursed? She didn't know the answer yet, but she knew she had to find out the truth first. The whole truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. Standing there surrounded by more wealth than most people could imagine, Grace felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a mantle she wasn't sure she was strong enough to wear. But she would try. For Emma, for Thomas, and for whatever truth he died protecting. She would find the courage to carry this burden forward. Because sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't money or property, it's the opportunity to do what's right, even when you're terrified of the consequences. The drive to Santa Fe felt different this time. Grace's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, her eyes checking the rearview mirror more frequently than necessary. Emma chattered happily in the back seat, pointing at roadside stands selling turquoise jewelry and asking if they could stop for ice cream later, blissfully unaware that her mother's world had shifted on its axis in the space of 24 hours. Harrison Wells's office was in a modern building downtown, all glass and steel that caught the high desert light and threw it back in geometric patterns. Grace held Emma's hand as they rode the elevator to the 5th floor, her chest constricting with each ascending number. The receptionist greeted them warmly and led them to a conference room where the lawyer was waiting. Harrison Wells was exactly as Grace had imagined from his voice. Mid-50s, gray hair, expensive suit, the kind of man who dealt with complicated estates and family secrets as naturally as other people discussed the weather. "Miss Thompson, thank you for coming," he said, standing to offer his hand. "And this must be Emma." "Hi," Emma said shyly, staying close to her mother's side. Wells gestured to leather chairs around a polished table. "Please sit. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "Water would be good," Grace said, her throat dry with anticipation. They settled into chairs that probably cost more than Grace made in a month, and Wells pulled a file from his briefcase. Inside was a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, with Grace's name written across it in careful script. "Your uncle left this for you 17 years ago," Wells said, his voice carrying the weight of long-held responsibility. "He was very specific that it was to be given to you only after his death, and only in person. I've been holding it in trust ever since." 17 years. Grace would have been 15, just a sophomore in high school, still believing her father's stories about Uncle Thomas being off seeing the world. Still young enough to think families always told each other the truth. "Did you know him well?" Grace asked, staring at the envelope as if it might reveal its secrets through the paper. Wells nodded slowly. "We met 3 times over the years. Once when he established this arrangement, once about 5 years ago when he updated his will, and once more just 6 months before his death. He was intense, very private, and he carried himself like a man who'd seen things he wished he could forget." "Did he say why he chose me?" "No, but I got the impression that he'd been watching you from a distance, that he believed you were stronger than you knew." Wells leaned back in his chair. "Miss Thompson, I need to tell you something. In all my years practicing law, I've never had a client who paid me in cash for nearly 2 decades, or who insisted on meeting in different locations each time, or who made it clear that if anything happened to him under any circumstances, you were to receive everything immediately. No questions asked." Grace's stomach tightened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying your uncle was either very paranoid or very careful. Given what I knew about his background, I suspect it was the latter." "What did you know about his background?" Wells hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "He mentioned he'd worked for the government. Something about research, classified projects. He never gave details, but he always seemed like a man who'd been carrying a heavy burden for a very long time." Grace's hands trembled as she reached for the envelope. It felt heavier than paper should, weighted with secrets and possibilities, and the accumulated silence of 17 years. She broke the seal and pulled out several sheets of paper covered in Thomas's tight handwriting. She walked to the window overlooking downtown Santa Fe, needing space and privacy for whatever truth was about to unfold. Behind her, she could hear Wells speaking quietly to Emma, asking about school and showing her how to make paper airplanes from sticky notes. Grace unfolded the letter and began to read. My dearest Grace, if you're reading this, then I'm dead, and you've inherited far more than a house in the desert. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for putting this burden on you, but you're the only family I have left. And more importantly, you're the only person I trust with what I'm about to tell you. Your father was a good man, better than me. When we were young, we were inseparable, but I made choices that drove us apart. I got involved in things I shouldn't have, saw things that couldn't be unseen. And when I tried to make it right, I became a target. The gold in the chamber, and yes, I know you found it by now. You always were curious, even as a child when I watched you from a distance. That gold was stolen, but not by me. It was stolen from the American people by men in positions of trust, men who used their power to enrich themselves while others suffered. I worked at Los Alamos from 1989 to 1996. During that time, I discovered a program called Project Goldstream, an illegal operation that was funneling gold from secure government reserves and selling it on the black market. The money was being used to fund covert operations that Congress never approved, operations that killed people, toppled governments, destroyed lives. I tried to expose it through proper channels. I went to supervisors, to internal affairs, to the inspector general. Nothing happened. The program continued. People kept dying. So I did something desperate and probably stupid. I stole the evidence, and I stole some of the gold. Not all of it, just what I could move without being caught. 4,000 bars, $265 million at today's prices. I've been hiding it for 28 years, waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. But that moment never came. The men behind the program are still out there, still powerful, still dangerous. And I'm just one man, tired and scared and running out of time. So I'm giving it to you. The gold and the documents that prove where it came from. What you do with it is your choice. You can report it and hope the authorities are clean, though I warn you some of those authorities are the ones who stole it in the first place. You can keep it and use it to build a life for yourself and Emma. God knows you deserve that after everything you've endured. Or you can do what I couldn't. You can expose the truth and make sure the people responsible finally pay. Whatever you choose, know that I'm proud of you. I watched you from afar all these years. I saw you struggle. I saw you survive. I saw you become a mother who would do anything for her child. That's why I chose you. Not because you're perfect, but because you're strong. And this world needs strong people willing to fight for what's right. There are men who will come looking for this gold eventually. When they do, remember that the house has more defenses than what you've seen. Trust the systems I built and trust yourself. You're stronger than you know. I love you, Grace. I always have. I'm sorry I never had the courage to tell you in person. Your Uncle Thomas. Grace stood at the window for a long time after finishing the letter, tears streaming down her face. She folded the papers carefully and returned to the table where Emma was still making paper airplanes, and Wells was pretending they were having aerial combat. Are you all right? Wells asked, noting her expression. Grace wiped her eyes and sat down. He left me more than a house. I suspected as much. What do you need from me? Grace looked at Emma, then back at the lawyer. I need to know what my options are. Legal options. If someone inherited something that was originally stolen, but they didn't know it was stolen, and the person who left it to them was trying to expose the original theft, what would happen? Wells leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. That's a complex question that would depend on many factors: the value of the items, the nature of the original crime, the evidence available, the intentions of the inheritor. Generally speaking, stolen property belongs to its rightful owner, regardless of how it came into someone else's possession. But if the inheritor cooperates with authorities and helps expose the original crime, they might be protected. They might, especially if they qualify for whistleblower protection. He studied her carefully. Miss Thompson, if you're in possession of evidence of a federal crime, you need to be very careful about how you proceed. And you need to be prepared for the possibility that some people won't want that evidence to see the light of day. Grace thought about the gold, the documents, the security system Thomas had built. She thought about the letters warning that men would come looking. What if I told you that some of those people might be willing to kill to keep their secrets buried? Wells' expression grew serious. Then I would tell you to consider federal protection, and I would recommend that you don't try to handle this alone. He pulled a business card from his pocket and wrote a number on the back. This is the direct line for a friend of mine at the FBI, someone I trust. If you decide you need help, call her first. The drive back to the cave house felt like traveling through a different world. Every car that passed seemed suspicious, every shadow potentially threatening. Emma had fallen asleep in the back seat, exhausted by the day's adventure, leaving Grace alone with her thoughts and the weight of the decision she had to make. By the time they reached the dirt road leading to Rose Creek, the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of fire and gold that reminded Grace uncomfortably of the treasure hidden in the stone chamber. She parked the car and sat there for a moment, looking up at the house carved into the cliff face, this impossible refuge that had become both sanctuary and trap. "We're home, baby," she said softly, waking Emma. "Are we staying here forever now?" Emma asked, rubbing her eyes. Grace looked at her daughter, 7 years old, innocent, trusting, completely dependent on her mother to make the right choices. "I don't know yet, sweetheart, but whatever we decide, we'll decide together." That night after Emma was asleep, Grace sat in the main room with Thomas's letter spread out before her, the weight of $265 million in gold pressing down on her from behind the hidden wall. She thought about the classified documents in the secret chamber, evidence of crimes that had never been prosecuted. She thought about the men Thomas had warned her about, powerful people who wouldn't hesitate to kill to protect their secrets. And she thought about the choice her uncle had given her: stay silent and safe, or speak up and risk everything for the chance at justice. Grace had spent most of her adult life feeling powerless, at the mercy of circumstances and other people's choices. Robert's violence, her employer's whims, an economy that seemed designed to keep people like her struggling. But sitting in that stone room, surrounded by evidence of corruption and holding proof of crimes committed by the powerful against the powerless, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt like she had a choice that mattered, a voice that could create change. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Outside, the desert wind whispered across the mesas, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of storms on the horizon. Grace folded the letter carefully and placed it in the desk drawer next to Thomas's journal. Tomorrow she would have to decide which path to take. But tonight, for the first time since Robert had walked out and left her world in ruins, Grace Thompson felt like she might be ready to stop running and start fighting. Because some things were worth the risk. Truth was worth the risk. Justice was worth the risk. And Emma, sleeping peacefully in the next room, was worth everything. This is the moment where Grace has to choose between running away safe or standing up for what's right. We've all faced moments like this in our own lives. What gave you the courage to stand up when it mattered most? 3 days passed in the cave house like a held breath. Grace went through the motions of normal life, making meals, reading to Emma, exploring the immediate area around their cliff dwelling. But her mind was constantly elsewhere, weighing possibilities, calculating risks. trying to find a path forward that didn't end in disaster. She'd memorized every word of Thomas's letter, studied every document she could safely access in the hidden chamber, and spent hours staring at the gold bars that represented both salvation and potential destruction. The wealth was staggering, enough to solve every problem she'd ever had, but she couldn't shake the feeling that accepting it would create new problems far worse than poverty. It was on the fourth morning that her decision was made for her. Grace woke to the sound of the security alarm, a soft chime that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Her blood turned to ice as she remembered the control panel Thomas had installed, the cameras that watched every approach to the house. She grabbed her phone and ran to the kitchen, activating the hidden screen. On the monitors, she could see them. 3 black SUVs making their way slowly along the dirt track toward the cliff, dust billowing behind them like storm clouds. Even from the grainy camera feed, she could tell these weren't tourists or lost hikers. The vehicles moved with purpose, maintaining formation, taking their time because they knew their target couldn't run. "Emma!" Grace called, her voice sharp with controlled panic. "Get dressed right now and come to the main room." Her daughter appeared from the bedroom, rubbing sleep from her eyes, sensing the urgency in her mother's voice, even if she couldn't understand it. "Mama, what's wrong?" Grace knelt down and took Emma's face in her hands, looking directly into those trusting brown eyes. "Baby, I need you to listen to me very carefully. There are some bad people coming here, and we need to hide. Can you be very, very brave for Mama?" Emma's eyes widened, but she nodded solemnly. "Like hide and seek?" "Exactly like hide and seek. But this time, we have to be completely silent, no matter what happens. Promise me." "I promise. Mama." Grace grabbed a backpack and threw in the most important documents from Thomas's desk. The letter, the journal, samples of the evidence that proved Project Goldstream's existence. She couldn't take the gold. It was too heavy, too obvious. But she could take proof of where it came from. On the security monitors, the SUVs had stopped about 200 yards from the base of the cliff. Men in dark clothing were getting out, 6 of them that she could see, all moving with the fluid precision of people accustomed to violence. One pulled out binoculars and scanned the cliff face while another spoke into a radio. They were looking for the entrance, but Thomas had hidden it well. From their angle, it would just be another shadow in the rock face. Grace made a quick decision. She activated the house's passive defenses, the ones Thomas had mentioned in his journal, but which she'd never fully understood until now. Hidden speakers came online, broadcasting the sounds of wind and wildlife to mask any noise from inside. The house's heat signature was dampened by systems built into the rock itself. To thermal imaging, the cliff would look empty, but they wouldn't be fooled for long. "Mama, I'm scared," Emma whispered. "I know, baby. But Uncle Thomas built this place to keep us safe. We just have to trust him." Grace watched the monitors as the men began to climb the stone steps, moving carefully but confidently. They knew exactly where they were going. When they reached the door, one of them examined the lock while another pulled out what looked like a small explosive device. "Miss Thompson," a voice called from outside, amplified by some kind of speaker system. "We know you're in there. We're not here to hurt you or your daughter. We just want to discuss the return of some property that belongs to our employers." Grace said nothing, barely breathing, praying that Emma would stay quiet. "Your uncle took something that didn't belong to him. We're prepared to compensate you generously for its return. More money than you could spend in several lifetimes. All you have to do is open the door." The voice was reasonable, almost friendly, but Grace could hear the threat underneath it, like a snake hiding in tall grass. These weren't people who took no for an answer. When she didn't respond, the tone changed. "Miss Thompson, you have 30 seconds to open this door. After that, we open it ourselves." And the conversation becomes much less pleasant. Grace's hands were shaking so badly she could barely operate the controls, But she managed to access the defensive systems Thomas had built into the house. The cliff face above the entrance was riddled with carefully placed charges designed to look like natural rock formations, but capable of creating a controlled avalanche. 20 seconds. She thought about Emma, about the life they could have if she just opened that door and gave them what they wanted. The gold would go back to wherever it came from. They'd disappear into their comfortable lives, and she and Emma could keep the house and live quietly in the desert forever. 10 seconds. But then she thought about Thomas, alone for 3 decades, carrying the weight of secrets and the burden of truth that no one else would bear. She thought about the crimes documented in those classified files, the people who had died, the corruption that had never been exposed. 5 seconds. Grace pressed the button. The explosion was deafening, even from inside the stone house. The entire structure shook, dust raining from the ceiling as tons of carefully placed boulders broke free from the cliff face and tumbled down toward the entrance. Through the monitors, she could see the men scattering, diving for cover behind their vehicles as the avalanche crashed down where they'd been standing moments before. When the dust cleared, the stone platform at the entrance was buried under 20 feet of rock. No one was getting in that way, but no one was getting out either. The radio chatter from the surviving attackers was angry now. Professional calm replaced by frustration and determination. Grace watched them regroup, assess the situation, and begin looking for alternative approaches. They had rope, climbing gear, possibly explosives. This wasn't over. "What was that noise, Mama?" Emma whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "Just some rocks falling, baby. Sometimes that happens in the desert." Grace forced her voice to stay calm, reassuring. "But we need to go on our hiding adventure now, okay? Remember the game we talked about?" Emma nodded, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. Grace led her daughter to the back of the house, to the section of floor that concealed the emergency tunnel Thomas had carved through the living rock. It was narrow, dark, and would be terrifying for a 7-year-old, but it was their only way out. "This is going to be scary," Grace said as she pulled up the hidden stone panel, revealing the shaft that dropped down into darkness. "But I'll be right behind you the whole time, and we're going to come out somewhere safe." Emma peered into the tunnel, then looked back at her mother with trust that made Grace's heart break. "Will the bad people find us?" "Not where we're going. Uncle Thomas was very smart, and he made sure there was always a way out." The descent into the tunnel system was a nightmare that Grace would never forget. The rope ladder was old but sturdy, and she had to help Emma down rung by rung while carrying the backpack and fighting her own terror of enclosed spaces. The tunnel was barely wide enough for an adult, and the darkness was absolute beyond the reach of her phone's flashlight. They climbed down what felt like forever, 60 feet of carefully maintained ladder in the shaft Thomas had carved decades ago. Grace's arms ached from supporting Emma's weight, and her daughter's frightened breathing echoed off the stone walls like a trapped bird. Finally, her feet touched solid ground, and she helped Emma down the last few rungs. They were in a natural cavern, part of the cave system that Thomas had spent decades mapping and modifying. The air was cool and damp, and Grace could hear water trickling somewhere in the distance. Her phone's light revealed a passage leading away into the darkness, marked with reflective tape that Thomas had installed as a guide. "Stay close to me," Grace whispered, taking Emma's hand. "We're going to walk for a while, but then we'll be outside and safe." The journey through the tunnels felt like traveling through the Earth's circulatory system. Sometimes the passage was wide enough for them to walk side by side. Sometimes they had to squeeze through spaces so narrow that Grace wondered how Thomas had ever navigated them. Emma was incredibly brave, asking questions in a whisper, but never complaining, even when the path required them to crawl over rough stone that scraped their knees and hands. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Grace saw something that made her want to weep with relief, a faint glow of natural light ahead. The tunnel was rising, and the reflective tape markers were leading them toward the surface. The exit was hidden behind a screen of desert scrub, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Grace helped Emma through the narrow opening, then squeezed out herself, gasping in the fresh air and sunshine like a drowning person reaching the surface. They were on a hillside about a mile from the cave house, with a clear view across the canyon to where the black SUVs were still parked at the base of the cliff. Through binoculars that Thomas had cached near the tunnel exit, Grace could see men with climbing equipment making their way up the rock face, looking for alternative entrances. "Are we safe now?" Emma asked, her voice small and tired. Grace looked at her daughter, exhausted, dirty, frightened, but still trusting her mother to keep her safe, and felt something crystallize in her chest. Not just love, though that was there in abundance, but determination, resolve, the kind of strength that comes not from being fearless, but from being afraid and choosing to act anyway. "Not yet, baby, but we will be." Grace pulled out her phone and dialed the number Harrison Wells had written on the back of his card. It rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered. "Special Agent Sarah Chen, FBI. How can I help you?" "My name is Grace Thompson. Harrison Wells gave me your number. I need to report a crime, and I need protection for myself and my 7-year-old daughter." "What kind of crime?" Grace looked across the canyon at the men who were trying to break into her home, then at the backpack containing evidence of government corruption that had been buried for decades. "Government theft, conspiracy, and attempted murder. And Agent Chen, you're going to want to clear your schedule. This is going to take a while." The sun was setting by the time the FBI helicopters arrived, their rotor wash kicking up dust devils that danced across the desert floor, like spirits celebrating the arrival of justice. Grace sat on the hillside with Emma in her arms, watching as federal agents surrounded the men who had come to kill them, and she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt hope. Not the desperate hope of someone clinging to false promises, but the solid hope of someone who had chosen to stand up and fight back, who had decided that truth mattered more than safety, that justice was worth the risk. As Agent Chen approached with a team of investigators, Grace thought about Thomas, alone in his cliff dwelling for 3 decades, keeping his secrets and waiting for someone brave enough to share the burden. She squeezed Emma tighter and whispered, "Thank you, Uncle Thomas. I think I understand now what you meant about being stronger than I know. Because sometimes the most important thing we can do is not just survive our circumstances, but transform them. Sometimes the difference between being a victim and being a hero isn't about strength or resources or luck. It's about the moment when you decide that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost." And Grace Thompson, single mother, survivor, and accidental inheritor of a legacy that would change everything, was finally ready to fight. Grace stood in the main room of the cave house, now transformed into the headquarters of the Thomas Thompson Foundation. Through the windows, she could see Emma, now 12, leading a group of children whose mothers had found safety here, a refuge for families escaping domestic violence and corruption. The gold had been returned to the Treasury, but the government settlement of $8 million had funded something more valuable: hope. In 5 years, they had helped 200 families find safety and supported 15 whistleblowers in exposing corruption across multiple government agencies. Project Goldstream had been fully exposed, leading to 23 arrests and the creation of new oversight procedures for classified government assets. "Mama, the documentary crew is here," Emma called, her voice confident in ways that reminded Grace daily of how far they'd both come. Her daughter was no longer the frightened child sleeping in the back of a car. She was a young woman with dreams of becoming a civil rights lawyer, inspired by her mother's courage to stand up for justice. Grace smiled, touching the bronze plaque by the door. "In memory of Thomas Thompson, truth requires courage, but courage can change the world." The documentary was part of a series about ordinary Americans who'd expose government corruption. Grace had been reluctant to participate, But Emma had convinced her that their story might inspire others to speak up when they witnessed wrongdoing. "We're ready for you, Miss Thompson," the director said, adjusting the lighting equipment they'd set up in the main room. "Would you like to start with how you found this place?" Grace looked around the room where her life had changed forever. The smooth stone walls that had sheltered her uncle's secrets. The hidden chamber that had contained both treasure and terrible truth. The family they'd built here from the ashes of their old life. "Actually," she said, "I think I'll start with why some gifts are worth more than gold." As the cameras rolled, Grace told their story, not just the dramatic events of that first week, but the harder, more important work that had followed. The months of testimony, the threats from powerful people who wanted to silence her, the gradual building of trust with other whistleblowers who needed to know they weren't alone. She talked about the families who'd found refuge in the cave house's guest rooms, about the support network they'd built for people brave enough to expose corruption, about the scholarship fund they'd established for children of whistleblowers who'd lost their livelihoods fighting for truth. "The gold was never really mine," Grace said as the documentary drew to a close. "It belonged to the American people, and returning it was the easy part. The hard part was learning to use my voice, to believe that what I had to say mattered." She'd learned that some inheritances aren't about money. They're about finding the strength to stand up, speak out, and transform pain into purpose. And in this house carved from stone, surrounded by the endless desert that had once seemed so empty, Grace had discovered that sometimes the most important thing you can inherit is the chance to pass something better onto the next generation. After the film crew left, Grace and Emma sat on the stone platform at the house entrance, watching the sunset paint the desert in familiar shades of gold and amber. In the distance, they could see the lights of the small town that had grown up around the Foundation's work, a community of survivors, advocates, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd just taken the gold and run?" Emma asked, leaning against her mother's shoulder. Grace smiled, remembering the frightened woman she'd been 5 years ago, sleeping in a car and believing she had no choices left. "Sometimes. But then I remember what Uncle Thomas wrote in his letter, that the world needs strong people willing to fight for what's right. I think we were always meant to be those people. We just needed to find our strength." Emma was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm glad we stayed. I'm glad we fought." "Me too, baby. Me too." As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Grace felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a life lived with purpose. She'd inherited a cave house, a fortune in gold, and a legacy of secrets. But what she'd given back to the world was immeasurably more valuable. Proof that ordinary people could extraordinary things when they found the courage to stand up for truth. The story was far from over. There were new whistleblowers to support, new families to help, new battles for justice to fight. But Grace Thompson, former victim, current advocate, and proud inheritor of her uncle's legacy of courage, was ready for whatever came next. Because she'd learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest treasure isn't what you find hidden in the walls. It's what you build when you choose to tear those walls down and let the light in. Thank you for listening to Grace's story. Friends, have you ever found yourself at a crossroads where you had to choose between safety and doing what's right? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if Grace's courage inspired you today, please consider subscribing to our channel for more stories about ordinary people who discover their extraordinary strength. Remember, the heroes in our world aren't always the ones with capes and superpowers. Sometimes they're single mothers sleeping in cars, making impossible choices with grace and dignity. Sometimes they're people just like you, waiting for their moment to stand up and say, "This is wrong and I'm going to do something about it." What will your moment look like? And when it comes, will you be ready?